Hi, my name is India Adams, and today I will be discussing the 1973 Endangered Species Act and the controversy surrounding the repopulation efforts of the Mexican gray wolf. So, public perception of wildlife began to change in the 1960s and 1970s. This began with the environmental movement. It started with the public's perception of water and air pollution, then broadened in scope to include the natural environment. The attitude that man was the conqueror of the planet changed to we are now the keepers and protectors of our planet. And this is reflected in the Endangered Species Act. So in the dedication and thought that went into this piece of legislation was extensive. Throughout the legislation, effort was made to spell out in detail the responsibilities of the government and its agencies to conserve endangered species. This comprehensive piece of legislation covered everything from interagency cooperation, implementation, penalties and enforcement, international cooperation, and included an analysis of cost and funding. The responsibility of developing the Mexican gray wolf recovery plan was assigned to the Fish and Wildlife Service by the Secretary of the Interior. The Endangered Species Act also stipulated that any recovery plan was subject to review by the public and that the input of the public was to be considered before implementing any plan. So, although the Endangered Species Act was passed with little opposition, it's generated a lot of controversy, and this has resulted in a lot of lawsuits. So, since the passing of the Endangered Species Act, several amendments have been added. Among these amendments was the addition of the section on experimental populations. This section allows the Secretary to increase and decrease protections afforded to any reintroduced species. This amendment gave more latitude to the government agencies on how reintroduction could be handled. So this is important when developing a recovery plan for the Mexican gray wolf. Remember that public input had to be taken into consideration when developing a recovery plan. The Fish and Wildlife Service had to take into consideration the needs of the public as well as the needs of the Mexican wolf. The Mexican gray wolf once numbered in the thousands. Its original range encompassed the American Southwest, from Texas across New Mexico into Arizona, and then north up into Utah and Colorado. This range also extended as far south as Mexico City. So as settlers came west, the demands for food and furs all but eliminated the wolf's food source. The demand for meat to feed the growing population out west brought the cattle ranchers, and it wasn't long before cattle ranchers soon dominated the West. It's not surprising, since the wolves and other predators' food source was gone, that cattle and other livestock became a food source. So to combat the threat to their herds, ranchers began pressuring officials and enacted bounties on predators. Enough pressure was put on the government officials that a series of government-sponsored bounties were enacted, and the Biological Survey, which is now called the Fish and Wildlife Service, was tasked with eliminating predators. So these predators included mountain lions, bobcats, bears, coyotes, lynx, and the Mexican gray wolf. So starting in 1893, a series of bounties were enacted. These range from everything from territorial bounty acts to bounties from the livestock owners. And also contributing to the demise of the Mexican gray wolf was PARC, which is the Predatory Animal and Rodent Control. They sponsored hunting campaigns to eliminate the wolves from the Southwest. In the 1940s, the development of pesticide industry introduced the use of chemicals in the effort to kill wolves. Poisons were devastatingly effective in eliminating predators, and this information was also shared with Mexico, who also had the desire to eliminate wolves in their areas. So by the 1950s, the Mexican gray wolf and most large predators were eliminated from the Southwest. Then in 1973, the Endangered Species Act passed. It wasn't until 1976 that the Mexican gray wolf was listed as an endangered species, and the Mexican gray wolf is considered to be one of the most endangered mammals in North America. So in any controversy, there's two sides to an argument, And in the case of the reintroduction of the Mexican gray wolf, there are several. And this brings up several ethical issues. It's not a matter of who's right and who's wrong, because each side has valid arguments. It's how do we find a compromise so that we can preserve these animals. So if you think about the cattle ranchers in the Southwest, for 75 years, these ranchers have operated with only a minimal amount of threat from predators. Now they're having to deal with the reintroduction of wolves. It's not just the loss of cattle that affects the ranchers. Trying to protect against predation is costly. They would have to hire hands to ride the ranges to look out predators. And most small ranching operations simply can't afford the extra cost of more employees. There's also the issue that when predators are in the area, livestock behavior changes. They no longer graze normally, and so this can result in a loss of weight. When predators are in the area, this can also lower reproduction rates. So the average herd size in the Southwest is only approximately 147 head. So smaller operations like this, a loss of a single cow can really affect their bottom line. Although there are compensation programs in place for losses due to wolf predation, often ranchers decide not to apply for compensation because of the hassle involved. In order to apply for predation, one of the main obstacles the rancher has to overcome is the fact that it has to be determined that the cow was killed by predation and not by natural causes. So this means that number one, the rancher has to know almost immediately that the cow's been killed. If it's not, then in the time it takes for the rancher to realize that the cow has been killed, then to locate the carcass, any number of scavengers or predators can also feed from that carcass and destroy evidence of the kill. So this limits the amount of compensation that they can receive. So there are several compensation programs available. A couple of them are through the federal government. Another one used to be from Defenders of Wildlife. And unfortunately, they are no longer doing it, but this was once the Coexistence Council for Wolf and Livestock Predation came into existence. So there's other entities that are opposed to the reintroduction of Mexican gray wolf, and one of them is the hunters. Hunters object to the reintroduction of an apex predator in their area because in a hunter's mind, more wolves means less game to hunt. So in New Mexico and Arizona, elk and deer tags are issued by a draw system. And the number of tags that are available depends on the size of the herds as they're surveyed each year. So in fact, less deer and less elk means less tags. And this is their main bone of contention. So on the other side of the controversy are the wolf advocates. They have very good arguments. One, they feel that the Fish and Wildlife Service is acting too slow in releasing additional wolves into the wild. They also feel that their range is artificially restricted. When you compare the area for the release program and the historical range, it is in fact quite smaller. They also argue there is a problem. Well, there is a problem. If President Trump succeeds in erecting his border wall across the United States-Mexico border, this will cut off the corridors that a lot of endangered species use to go back and forth for mating and for hunting purposes. So it will also interfere with years of enforced environmental cooperation between Mexico and the United States. So earlier in my presentation, I mentioned how public input had to be considered in any recovery plan. Well, this puts the Fish and Wildlife Service dead center in the middle of the controversy. The Mexican gray wolf recovery plan is not just about the wolf. One of the responsibilities of the Fish and Wildlife Service is to find an equitable balance between the needs of the public, the environment, and those of the wildlife. As a federal agency, they must conform to the Endangered Species Act, and this requires that biological surveys and environmental impact studies are done. And these need to be filed according to the National Environmental Protection Act, which is NEPA. And this is also required by the Endangered Species Act. This means that opposition from the cattle industry, from hunters, from the wolf advocates, and the public must be considered. So this puts the Fish and Wildlife Service in a rather difficult position, and it's a rather unenviable task that they have been dealt with. So, and last but not least is the cost to taxpayers. So not only were tax dollars used in eliminating predators from the wild, now those tax dollars are used to protect endangered species. Tax dollars are also used to fund compensation programs, and the cost of just the recovery plan alone for the Mexican gray wolf is over $178,439,000, which this is over a 25 to 35 year plan. And that's just for the Mexican gray wolf. This doesn't include all the other endangered species that are throughout the United States. So it's important to ensure that future generations be able to enjoy wildlife, and it is a difficult task to try and figure out how to do this, especially with climate change. As climate change continues, this is going to affect more and more species of animals and plants, other wildlife, and the rates of endangered species will continue to rise as global warming does, and so will the cost. Anyway, thank you very much for sitting down and listening to my presentation, and I enjoyed giving it. Thank you very much.